Welcome to the Deep Dive, powered by Reformed Thinking. We have a fascinating set of notes in front of us today, all focused on Israel's hymn book, the Book of Psalms. We're going to be tracing the intellectual and editorial journey it took, how it went from this diverse collection of worship songs, royal prayers, and laments to becoming, well, the most frequently cited prophetic book in the New Testament.
That's right. Our main task in this deep dive is to really unpack how the Book of Songs was collected, how it was strategically organized, and then, crucially, how it was reinterpreted over many centuries. This whole process allowed it to shift from being, just liturgy for the temple into a coherent, a very precise witness to the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. We're tracking a clear, focused message here, the advance of God's kingdom into the world.
That's a huge mission. So let's get into it. We're looking at the Psalter as this theological center, this guidepost that points directly to that kingdom message. But, before we can even get to the prophecies, we have to understand the physical structure and the identity of this book in its original context. It's 150 compositions, all collected and organized. But what did the people of Israel actually call it? And what are we dealing with in terms of its age?
Well, the Hebrew name itself gives us the first clue about its identity, Tehillim.
Tehillim.
Yeah, and it simply means praises. So that shows its primary spiritual function right there. It's a book of praise.
Okay.
Then when the text was translated into Greek, that's where we get our term psalmoi. And that refers to a song that's specifically accompanied by stringed instruments, often suggesting the technical term pizzicato or plucking.
So music and praise are just hardwired into it from the very beginning. But when you talk about its age, are we talking about the time of David, or does it go back even further?
It goes back much, much further. We're talking about an incredible time span here. While, most of the collection is associated with David and the era after Solomon, Psalm 90 is actually attributed to Moses.
To Moses.
To Moses, which places some of the content way back during the wilderness wanderings. That makes it, by far, the oldest piece in the whole collection.
Wow.
And the sources also point out that the theological ideas and the literary forms inside the Psalter show parallels with other ancient Near Eastern texts, Sumerian, Akkadian, Ugaritic some, dating back to around 1400 BC.
So this isn't happening in a vacuum?
Not at all. This confirms that these are not just Israelite innovations, it's Israel's unique theological response to these ancient traditions. They basically integrated the best literary forms available at the time to elevate their worship of the one true God.
So you have a collection assembled over centuries, yet it was deliberately organized. The chronicler gives us an early peek into the liturgical life, and he validates a structure built around three main categories of worship. Let's focus on those foundational forms. Petition, leading to declarative praise, and then to descriptive praise.
Yeah, and that sequence moving from petition, or what we often call lament, to thanksgiving, which is declarative praise, and then to general praise or descriptive praise, that's not accidental, it's instructional. These three basic categories are affirmed in 1 Chronicles 16.4, where the Levites were appointed to make petition and invoke, to give thanks, and to praise the Lord. It shows us the theological life cycle of the worshiper. I cry out, I am delivered, and then I praise God for who he is.
Okay, let's start with the largest group and maybe the most recognizable. The petition psalms or the lament. These are those raw cries of distress. What makes this literary form so theologically vital?
The lament is defined by an immediate, direct address to God. And that very act is theologically crucial because it demonstrates the worshiper's complete dependence on God. The sources we have note that this dependence is really the defining difference between the covenant people and the pagan world around them. To seek deliverance or strength from anywhere else is, at its core, idolatry.
And the sources gave us that fantastic ancient phrase that captures the exact opposite of this kind of theological dependence.
Yes, the Babylonian phrase, ina ramanishu.
Ina ramanishu.
It means living by oneself, on one's own resources, without dependence on God. The theologian Helmer Ringren rightly said that concept, that self-reliance to the point of excluding the divine, is the very essence of sin.
So when a psalmist starts to lament, they are immediately rejecting ina ramanishu.
Exactly. They are declaring, my resources are gone, I am powerless, only the sovereign God can help me now.
That context adds so much weight to the laments. So the psalmist is venting their distress over a specific crisis. It could be sickness, persecution, a military threat, but the petition has to be directed upward.
Precisely. And the structure of the lament often mirrors the crisis itself. It starts with the complaint, focusing on the pain, the power of their enemies, their alienation from God. But it never, ever stays there. The genius of the lament is its pivot.
The confidence section. That pivot is so important for moving the reader from despair back to hope.
It is the hinge upon which the entire emotional and spiritual direction turns. It's often introduced by this powerful phrase, "but you."
But you.
The psalmist moves from describing the crushing reality of their circumstances to asserting the benevolent attributes of God. And this confidence is not subjective wishful thinking, it is anchored in objective theology. They look back to the moment God revealed himself to Moses in Exodus 34:6 as compassionate, gracious, patient, and abounding in love and faithfulness.
And that's the Reformed principle right there at its core. Our hope is rooted entirely in God's character and his actions, never in our own behavior or merit. It's completely God-centered.
Absolutely. The theological necessity here is that if God is who he says he is, compassionate and gracious, then the worshiper must turn their petition toward him. And even within the darkest laments, we find the penitential psalms, which deal with specific intentional sin, and they highlight this dependence on grace even more.
Let's talk about those for a moment. Psalm 51 is the classic example, right? Where David confesses the sins of murder and adultery sins, for which the Mosaic law offered no earthly sacrifice, no mechanism for restitution.
David's confession is just startling in its transparency. He recognizes his overt, intentional acts of sin, but he also recognizes his moral impotence. Knowing he cannot fix himself, he pleads not based on any human merit, but for God's Spirit to recreate him.
And he says, "Against you, you only have I sinned."
Right. David realized that while the crimes were committed against Bathsheba and Uriah, all sin is primarily and ultimately against the divine lawgiver.
And his hope for forgiveness, even for these capital offenses, rests entirely on grace.
Correct. David found forgiveness through the cleansing act represented by hyssop, which was a symbolic cleansing that, of course, foreshadows Christ's cleansing blood. It's a powerful assertion. There is no human resource capable of erasing sin. Forgiveness is through God's mercy alone. This shows that even within the Old Covenant, the concept of salvation was rooted in the sovereign grace of God.
So once that deliverance or that forgiveness is secured, the natural response is the second category, declarative praise. We tend to use the English word thanksgiving for this, but the source material suggests the Hebrew word is much more precise.
Yeah, the distinction is vital for understanding worship. Declarative praise is a public acknowledgement and praise specifically for an act of God's deliverance that the worshiper has personally experienced. The scholar Claus Westermann suggested that is better translated as to confess and praise, rather than just to thank.
What's the practical difference for an ancient Israelite?
Well, in English, thanking someone can be a private affair or even just a sense of obligation, a polite duty you have to perform.
Right.
In the Psalter, declarative praise is public, it's spontaneous, and it's entirely focused on elevating God by telling the story of what he has done. It's a confession before the community. I was in distress, I called upon him, he heard me, and this is how he delivered me. It follows a clear three-part structure, stating the intention to praise publicly, narrating the specific experience of deliverance, and then concluding with a formal testimony. It ties the community together through the shared history of redemption.
So if declarative praise is specific and personal, he lifted me out of the pit, then the final category, descriptive praise, must be broader.
It's the culmination. Descriptive praise celebrates God's person and his works in general. It moves beyond the specific intervention in the worshiper's own life and focuses on God's attributes as the creator, the ruler of history, and the Redeemer of Israel.
And what's the one key theological attribute that descriptive praise celebrates above all others?
That would be... This term appears 127 times in the Psalter. It is the absolute central focus of this type of worship. While it's often translated as unfailing love or kindness, it really carries the weight of covenant loyalty. It celebrates God's constancy and faithfulness to his promises.
And that constancy is what sets the God of Israel apart from all the surrounding polytheistic cultures.
Absolutely. The capricious gods of the ancient world, Baal, Marduk, they were fickle, often driven by arbitrary moods or petty jealousies. Worshipping them involved placating them just to prevent their wrath.
Right.
Descriptive praise, by celebrating Esau, exalts a God who is true to his word, consistent in his actions, and whose love is bound up in his covenant. This stability provided immense assurance to the covenant people. The simplest descriptive praise involved a call to praise, a cause for that praise, and then a renewed call to praise, establishing God's reliability as the foundation of all reality.
We've established the theological mechanics of the Psalter, but we can't really move on to the messianic section without confronting the imprecatory psalms, those difficult passages where the petitioner asks God to punish, even destroy their enemies, Many modern readers find these challenging, but our sources insist they are theologically sound.
They are, and they are considered most holy because they are fundamentally ethical, not personal. These are prayers by covenant saints who are suffering gross, often violent, injustice. The key to understanding them is realizing that these saints are not seeking personal revenge. They are seeking the establishment of God's righteous kingdom.
So they're delegating vengeance to the proper authority, not taking it into their own hands.
Precisely. They are rooted in the theological recognition that vengeance belongs only to God, as it says in Deuteronomy 32.35. David, who famously demonstrated personal generosity, sparing King Saul's life, showing mercy to Shimei, who cursed him, he couldn't have been driven by simple vindictiveness. Instead, when David prays these imprecations as the anointed king, he is functioning in his office.
That gives a critical distinction. The king represents the righteousness of the kingdom itself.
Yes. These psalms are ethical because they distinguish right from wrong. They're theocratic because they aim for the ultimate establishment of God's kingdom of righteousness. And they're theocentric because they aim for God's justice to be publicly acknowledged and praised. On top of that, they're covenantal. A wrong against the saint, who is aligned with the king, is viewed as a wrong against God himself.
And this connects directly to what Paul says later, that persecuting the church was an assault on Jesus Christ.
It's the very same principle. However, we do have to address the distinction made in the source material, that these are inappropriate for the church in the present dispensation. And the question is why? Why the change? It's because of the shift brought by Christ.
We are living in the already but not yet phase of the kingdom.
That is the core reason. The New Testament introduces realized eschatology, which means that while the prayers for thy kingdom come are still valid, the immediate application of ultimate justice is reserved for the final judgment. The Christian mandate, as typed by Christ, differentiates more distinctly between the sin and the sinner.
Right.
We are commanded to turn the other cheek, to pray for our enemies' forgiveness, and to conquer spiritual powers through suffering and love. While the Old Testament king asked God to execute judgment now, the church is instructed to wait for the final eschaton.
That sets the perfect stage for our next section. We have the foundational structure and forms. Now, we trace the typological path from the historical David, the author and the type, to the prophetic ideal of the Messiah, the antitype. This really starts with the definition of the concept itself, Mashiach.
The Hebrew root is mashah, which means to anoint. So the Mashiach is literally the anointed one, someone who is publicly designated for divine status and authority. The anointing ceremony, usually performed with oil, consecrated that person as God's exclusive property. It implied divine protection, and it equipped them with God's Spirit for their appointed task.
And this title was initially quite broad in its application across Old Testament history, wasn't it?
It was. It wasn't reserved for one future figure at the beginning. We see it applied to patriarchs, to prophets, to priests, and most prominently to historical kings like Saul and David. These kings were seen as conduits. The reigning Israelite monarch was viewed as the Son of God in a covenantal sense, representing the invisible king I am before the people. He was supposed to be endowed with righteousness and act as the source of strength and blessing for the whole nation.
And this high ideal is then cemented in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7.16.
That covenant is the theological bedrock of all subsequent messianic expectation. God promised David an eternal house, kingdom, and throne. And this wasn't a promise that was contingent on David's personal faithfulness. It was an unconditional decree that established the expectation of a single, ideal, future king whose reign would exist forever, ruling in the final age, the eschaton.
But here's the major plot point. The historical kings, David's successors, they continually failed to measure up to this divine standard. They were idolatrous, unjust, politically compromised. How did the Psalter, their own hymn book, manage this huge theological tension between the ideal and the reality?
The royal psalms contained ideals that drastically surpassed historical reality, and this intentional overreach created the necessary theological void. They spoke of the king ruling to the ends of the earth, enduring as long as the sun and moon, and sitting at God's right hand, as Psalm 110.1 says. No historical king, certainly not Rehoboam or Ahaz, fulfilled these cosmic and divine descriptions.
So the ideal existed in the song, but not in the palace.
Exactly. The songs acted as perpetual promissory notes. These ideals were always pregnant with messianic expectations. They forced the faithful to look beyond the immediate flawed monarch to a spiritual fulfillment, a discontinuity in typology moving from the flawed carnal type, the historical king, to the perfect spiritual antitype, the Messiah. The failure of the human monarchy became the engine that drove sacred history toward the ultimate fulfillment.
And the prophets then picked up that baton, clarifying and detailing the nature of this future king. What did first Isaiah contribute to this doctrine?
First, Isaiah laid out the lineage and the identity with breathtaking clarity. He foresaw a glorious future son of David, born miraculously of a virgin, an Alma, who would be called Emmanuel, God with us.
God with us.
And even more astonishingly, in Isaiah 9.6, he gave this king divine names: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This immediately raised the expectation that the future Davidic king would be more than merely human. He would share the very attributes of the divine.
And the prophets also added geographical detail.
Micah, a contemporary of Isaiah, zoomed in on the physical birthplace. He predicted the humble origin of the Messiah in Bethlehem, a small, insignificant town. Yet this king would have a glorious, universal, and enduring reign, one who would stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of I Am. The combination of divine identity and humble origins created a paradox that only Christ could fulfill.
But the most shocking addition to the Messianic doctrine came later, from 2nd Isaiah, introducing the necessity of suffering before triumph. This was a radical departure from the expectation of a conquering king.
It was an incredible theological challenge for the people. 2nd Isaiah introduced the anonymous suffering servant in chapters 52 and 53. This servant, who is true Israel, the faithful remnant, offers his life as an atonement for sin, suffering vicariously for the iniquity of others.
So the sequence is clear.
Very clear. Humiliation, death, followed by resurrection, ascension, and glorification. This prophetic contribution embedded the crucial doctrine that the Messiah must first suffer a sacrificial death before he could enter his cosmic glory. The Psalter needed both the suffering laments and the enthronement hymns to hold the full picture.
Now, let's ground this back in the Psalter's composition itself. We talked earlier about the superscriptions, those little notes attributing authorship to David or providing historical context, like Psalm 3 being composed while he was fleeing from Absalom. For many years, academic opinion just dismissed these notes. Where do the sources place the current credibility of Davidic authorship?
Well, academic opinion is slowly but surely swinging back toward recognizing the antiquity and reliability of these superscriptions, really forced by the weight of external evidence. Historically, yes, many scholars discarded them as unreliable later additions. However, consistency found in the chronicler's history, later Jewish tradition like Josephus, and even the Qumran scrolls supports their authenticity and early dating.
And the linguistic argument about the preposition is key here.
Absolutely. The preposition, when used with a name like David, commonly denotes authorship in the Semitic languages, just as a Psalm of David suggests, written by David. This interpretation is solidified by synoptic superscriptions, like those in Sample Samuel 22.1 and Psalm 18.1. This is so important because accepting the authorship notices ensures the Psalms represent theology at work in real life.
It transforms them from just abstract poems into these intimate historical reflections.
Precisely. Knowing that David composed Psalm 3 while fleeing the ultimate betrayal from his own son, Absalom, it gives immense emotional weight to his words. I lie down and sleep, I wake again because I am sustains me. It anchors David's personal struggles, his anguish, his confidence, his petitions, directly in the context of the Davidic covenant. This validated the New Testament's typological reading, which says, if David suffered this much as a covenant king, how much more must the perfect king suffer?
This historical grounding leads us right to the most fascinating moment in the Psalter's history, the major editorial pivot. Section 3, the post-exilic masterstroke. We need to set the scene around 586 BC.
The Babylonian exile was an absolute catastrophe. The temple was destroyed, the people were deported, and most relevant for our discussion, the earthly monarchy ended. Israel was left without a king and with a wardrobe of royal robes in their hymnody. They had this huge collection of songs celebrating an eternal kingdom and a reigning monarch, yet their current reality was subjugation and loss.
The anguish over this historical fracture must have been immense. Where do we see this theological distress most acutely within the Psalter's structure?
The pain is intensely concentrated in Book 3, which is Psalms 73 through 89. This section is often called the Dark Book because it wrestles so profoundly with the problem of the failed Davidic covenant. It culminates in Psalm 89, which ends with this anguished cry questioning God's promises. Where is your unfailing love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David?
And yet, despite this failure, the unconditional nature of the covenants to Abraham and David meant the faithful could not abandon the hope of triumph. This vacuum, the absence of a king, became the necessary fuel for intense messianic expectation.
It absolutely did. And this led to a massive, deliberate editorial decision, likely around 520 BC, during the post-exilic period. The editors, facing a community without a political head, needed to re-signify the collection. They consciously focused the entire Psalter on the king, meaning the future king.
So they took the historical royal psalms and draped them on the shoulders of Messiah.
That is the core insight. They strategically reinterpreted these historical prayers and anthems, coloring all 150 compositions with a messianic hue. They ensured that every reader, from that point forward, understood the Davidic promises were not just about some historical figure who failed, but about the future perfect king. This organizational work transformed a collection of ancient hymns into a forward-looking prophecy.
And the physical structure itself shows this intention. The organization of the 150 psalms into 5 distinct books is not arbitrary.
No, the division into 5 books consciously echoes the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. This parallel was a deliberate theological statement. It signaled the Psalter's status as a foundational, authoritative guide for the community. Just as the Pentateuch guided Israel's life through the law, the Psalter guided Israel's worship and expectation through praise and prayer. The editors presented David, in a sense, as Israel's Mozart, taking the foundational law and translating it into this vast, expressive, organized work of art for the congregation.
But the real interpretive genius lies at the very beginning of the book. Psalms 1 and 2, the interpretive gateway. They lack superscriptions and they set the theological frame for the whole collection.
This is the editorial masterstroke. Psalm 1 starts broadly, contrasting the righteous individual who delights in God's instruction, the Torah, with the wicked. The placement of this song transformed the book from a simple list of temple liturgy into a book designed for reflective individual meditation, which was essential for the decentralized post-exilic synagogue. It acts as the garden gate. Only those who delight in God's instruction, the covenant keepers, are prepared to engage with the hymns that follow.
But the reader's focus doesn't stay on that generic righteous individual for long.
No. Psalm 2 immediately escalates and narrows the focus. It takes the righteous individual and narrows him down to the righteous individual. I am's anointed king. It shifts the conflict from a personal struggle against local wickedness to a cosmic confrontation, the nations raging against God's universal rule and his king. This prepares the reader to interpret every subsequent prayer, lament, or thanksgiving in relation to 2 figures: the ideal, promised king and the individuals within his eternal kingdom.
Let's follow that theological story through the 5 books. This progression isn't accidental. It confirms the narrative intention of the editors.
Books 1 and 2, so Psalms 1 to 72, are explicitly royal. They establish the Davidic covenant, they introduce the king, and they feature his personal prayers lamenting persecutions, celebrating victory. They progress from Psalm 2, which establishes the covenant promise, all the way to Psalm 72, which concludes Book 2 with a fervent prayer for the king's son to rule justly, passing on those eternal covenant promises.
Then the narrative hits that crisis point in Book 3.
Book 3, Psalms 73 to 89, is the profound interlude of doubt. As we just discussed, this is the dark book concerning the perceived failure and fracture of the Davidic covenant because of the exile. The failure of the historical monarchy intensifies the expectation that the future fulfillment must be spiritual and supernatural, not just a political reestablishment.
And Book 4 then provides the community's theological response to that failure. What does Israel do when the earthly king is gone?
In the absence of an earthly monarch, Israel necessarily redirects its worship back to its origins. They look back to Moses, who is attributed with the opening psalm of this section, Psalm 90, and they redirect their focus to I am as the eternal king. This section contains the famous enthronement psalms, 93 through 99, which declare God's universal and righteous kingdom. The editors intended these psalms to be interpreted messianically, referring to the king's reign, through whom God rules the world at the end of the ages.
It's the ultimate pivot, shifting reliance from the human throne to the divine throne, and that leads to Book 5, which views the future with a kind of realized hope.
Book 5, Psalms 107 to 150, begins by treating the regathering from exile as an established fact, a victory accomplished by God. David is no longer just the historical king. He's now presented as an exemplary model of personal piety and reliance on God for the returnees. This book is saturated with prominent messianic hope, particularly in its final sections.
What are the key prophetic texts in Book 5 that really stand out?
Well, Psalm 118, which describes the rejected king becoming the cornerstone, the capstone of the entire building. And critically, Psalm 110.1, which is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, it contains the ultimate prophetic vision of a king who is greater than David, seated at God's right hand, functioning as a priest king forever after the ancient and mysterious order of Melchizedek.
So the Psalter's structural journey is complete.
It's complete. From the individual's cry in Book 1, through the failure of the human type in Book 3, to the affirmation of God's sovereignty in Book 4, and culminating in the vision of the king-priest in Book 5.
That transition leads us directly to Section 4, the fulfillment. It's so clear that the New Testament writers saw this entire edited, structured book as an immediate confirmation of Jesus Christ's identity. The statistics alone are staggering.
The quantitative significance really cannot be overstated. When we look at the entire New Testament, out of 283 direct quotations from the Old Testament, 116 of them, a remarkable 41%, are sourced from the Psalter.
41%.
41%. Jesus himself, in his teaching and ministry, alluded to the Psalms over 50 times. This means that for the early church, the Psalter was the primary lens through which they understood Jesus' mission, his suffering, and his glorification.
And this reliance is based on the theological mechanism of typology, where David and the historical kings were the type, and Christ is the antitype.
That is the necessary framework. The New Testament views David and Israel's kingship as patterns or types of Christ. But Christ is the antitype, the perfect fulfillment who always exceeds and is greater than the flawed human pattern.
And we see this contrast everywhere. David was a mighty king, but he was also a sinner.
Precisely. David confesses intentional sin, murder, adultery in the penitential Psalms. Christ is the sinless, perfect king. David is the Son of God merely as a covenant heir, adopted into a royal line. Christ is the unique Son of God, united with God from eternity, proven by the virgin birth and his pre-incarnate glory. Even the most intimate, raw expressions of anguish in David's laments foreshadowed a greater reality of spiritual suffering endured by the perfect king.
Let's discuss how the New Testament applies the Psalter. The Apostle Peter famously uses Psalm 16.10 to confirm Christ's resurrection in his Pentecost sermon. This relies on a pretty nuanced linguistic point about the Hebrew word shait.
This is one of the most intellectually satisfying typico-prophetic applications. Psalm 16.10b reads, "You will not let your Holy One see decay." Peter argues that David's tomb is still with them. David died and his body decayed. Therefore, David must have been prophesying about someone else, the Messiah, whose body would not see decay.
And the modern debate often centers on whether shait should be translated as pit, meaning simply grave or death, or if it truly means decay or corruption.
Right, because if shat only meant pit, then the psalm simply reads, "You won't let me die," which is clearly untrue for David, who died and was buried. However, Peter, following the Septuagint and other ancient versions, interpreted the masculine form of shat as meaning decay or corruption. The linguistic evidence strongly supports this ancient view. When the Hebrew intends to refer to a place, like a pit, it typically uses a verb of motion, like to go down into. When it refers to a state like decay, it uses the verb to see or to experience.
So the grammar and the context confirm Peter's audacious theological claim. The psalmist was indeed predicting the imperishable nature of the Messiah's body after death.
That is the core takeaway. The linguistic structure confirms that the Psalter contains specific, detailed prophecies of the resurrection, not just a general hope for avoiding death.
We can categorize the New Testament's use of the Psalter into three distinct applications. First, there's the indirect or typical application.
This is the broad application of David's general human experiences to Christ. So, for example, David's expression of confidence on the cross. "Into your hands I commit my spirit," which is from Psalm 31.5, or the general laments about unjust persecution, like "those who hate me without reason," from Psalm 35.19. These psalms, which were written in small letters concerning David's personal passions, are understood to be written in large letters concerning Christ's ultimate experience of suffering and vindication.
Second, there's the typico-prophetic application, where the language transcends David's own life entirely.
These are the direct, detailed predictions that David could not have fulfilled himself. These include the accounts of the crucifixion, such as, "They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing," from Psalm 22.1e, or the preservation of his body. "Not one of his bones will be broken," from Psalm 34.20. These specific details moved beyond general types and became precise fulfillment criteria for the Messiah.
And finally, the purely prophetic application, where the psalm speaks only of the superior status of the Anointed One.
That category is dominated by Psalm 110. It is the core text used by the apostles and Jesus himself. In this psalm, David speaks of his greater son. I am says to my Lord, sit in my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Jesus used this text to question the Pharisees. How can the Messiah be merely David's son if David calls him Lord? This demonstrated the Messiah's superior, divine, and eternal status over David, a notion that was wholly unthinkable for a mere mortal king from an Old Testament perspective.
Despite this overwhelming body of prophecy confirming his divine status and royal role, Jesus often preferred the title Son of Man over the heavily loaded term Messiah. Why the aversion to the title that so clearly defined his role?
Because Jesus radically redefined the nature of messiahship. Post-exilic Judaism and the intertestamental literature had developed a very strong political expectation. They craved a David redivivus, a military king who would conquer the Roman oppressors, restore the political sovereignty of Israel, and establish a national kingdom.
The term Messiah had become intrinsically political.
It was so politically charged that if Jesus had used it publicly as his primary title, his mission would have been instantly misunderstood by his contemporaries. The Jewish people would have tried to crown him immediately and start a political revolt. Jesus instead came for spiritual transformation. He demanded repentance from self-righteousness and corrupt religious practices and required personal trust in him. He was establishing a spiritual kingdom built on grace, not an earthly one based on military conquest. His use of Son of Man, drawn from Daniel 7, emphasized his heavenly, eternal authority and his eventual return in glory, distancing himself from the limited political expectations of the time.
And that redefinition brings us back to the theology of the already but not yet.
Exactly. The New Testament introduces realized eschatology. The fulfillment of a messianic expectation is already accomplished in Jesus' first advent through his death and resurrection and the establishment of his church. The not yet is the future consummation at his return. Because the New Testament sees the entire collection pointing to Christ, it even identifies the everlasting Creator, spoken of in the Psalter, with Jesus Christ himself, quoting Psalm 102.25-27 and Hebrews 1.10-12, confirming Christ's pre-incarnate glory and divinity.
What a phenomenal sweep of sacred history. We've moved from these ancient compositions influenced by Near Eastern literary forms through the raw personal anguish of a historical king to the catastrophic failure of the monarchy and finally to a divinely guided editorial process that structured the entire book to focus on one single fulfillment, Jesus Christ, the eternal king. The Psalter is not a random collection. It's a structured, edited book designed to guide God's people.
That strategic editing process, particularly around 520 BC, provided the intellectual and theological framework that ensures every element of the Psalter, the lament of Book 3, the enthronement of Book 4, the explicit prophecies of Book 5 points consistently to the necessary suffering and subsequent glory of the Anointed One. It truly transformed a set of ancient hymns into the foundational prophecy of the New Covenant era.
So we begin our discussion with the historical grounding of Psalm 3, David fleeing Absalom, as a piece of lived theology. If David's flight is a type of Christ's suffering and ultimate betrayal, and his confidence in God is a model for the covenant people facing persecution, how does applying these historical, structural, and messianic approaches to a personal lament today enrich our assurance?
Well, when you read Psalm 3 today, you gain 3 layers of assurance. First, historically, we understand David's personal suffering, betrayal, flight, danger, and the pattern it provides for venting anguish while maintaining objective faith. Second, structurally, the post-exilic editors teach us that we are reading this lament with the Messiah in mind, knowing that the ultimate failure of man, the monarchy, paved the way for the ultimate triumph of God's king. And finally, messianically, we realize we are members of a royal priesthood, and we are praying these psalms not just after David, but with our reigning king. Our personal struggles, like David's, are framed within Christ's guaranteed narrative. Knowing that our king secured the victory promised in that same Psalter, his suffering leading to his eternal enthronement, that provides a source of assurance that our hope is anchored in the spiritual reality of God's unshakable eternal kingdom, no matter what the immediate earthly crisis is.